Here at JSM Pros, we teach AWE, the Approval Workflow Engine class, regularly. And absolutely love the AWE class. Just a little bit of history about AWE if you're not familiar with it. If you look at the history of approvals with PeopleSoft, it started with Virtual Approver. And Virtual Approver is an app designer solution. Me as a developer, I would go into App Designer and make changes to the approval rules. Well, the e-procurement team and financials, they got to look at that and they thought, that doesn't seem right. That doesn't make sense. They said because the person that actually knows the rules, that's the functional analyst. And for the functional analyst to get a rule changed, they would first need to communicate that rule to a developer. The developer would then have to understand the rule, rewrite the rule, and then give it back to the analyst for testing purposes. And so the financials team, e-procurement, said, I think we could simplify this quite a bit if we just exposed the rules to the analysts and said, hey, why don't you just go ahead and write your own rules? So that's where AWE started. It started as an e-procurement project, which today is now available throughout the entire suite of PeopleSoft applications. Now, what I really love about AWE is that it's built on top of PeopleTools itself. I mean, if you and I were going to write an approval framework in PeopleTools, this is what we would do. This is how we do it. And the fact that it's even possible, I think that's just amazing. But every time I teach one of these AWE classes, a student asks a question about some feature that I have to say, no, I'm sorry. That's not how AWE works. It's not possible in AWE. So I'm always looking for, hey, what are the alternatives? What are the options? How can we enhance or extend AWE to get some of these features into AWE? I mean, let me just give you an example. One of my students asked about routing recently. And they said, when we submit a routing to AWE, we noticed that the routing seems to be built out immediately when you submit. But what we find is we actually need to make changes based on logic so that when one event happens, we need to reroute to a different person. But in AWE, there's no way to perform that, quote, dynamic routing. I know that's kind of funny because if you look at AWE documentation, it does talk about dynamic routing, but it's dynamic up to the launch point. Once you launch something into AWE, it's fixed. Now, what if your people change seats within your organization? I'm sorry, the routing's already fixed. It's already been defined who it's routing to, even if those people change seats. Now, you and I as administrators, of course, we can move that around, but no, seriously, is there another alternative to that? Is there a way that we can enhance AWE? So with that, I've asked Paul Taylor from Gideon Taylor to join me this week to talk about their product, which seems to enhance the AWE solution. So Paul, if you wouldn't mind, would you share with the audience a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your company?
You bet. Paul Taylor. I am the founder and CEO of Gideon Taylor. I'm a longtime PeopleSoft techie, and so it's a little bit awesome to be on Jim Marion's screen here because I've looked up to Jim for many years, and but yeah, we've been building custom solutions for PeopleSoft clients for many years. And a lot of those solutions have included workflow-based solutions and solutions that are electronic form-based and then integrated into workflow. So we have lots of real-world experience, people asking, hey, can you make it do this? And then we see if we can do that with delivered PeopleSoft tools. If we can't, then we add that functionality to our own tool set, which we started building again, because of this need for extended functionality for form building and for workflow. And so we built that in order to meet real world demand. And as we run into new real world demand, we try to add those features into GTE Forms, which is our PeopleTools bolt-on electronic form toolkit for PeopleSoft applications. Really, we go back to around 2003. I was at that point mostly just an independent contractor in the PeopleSoft space, and I had loved the concept of business process automation. The idea that you could move a form or move a piece of work from one person to the next person to the next person, and automate the redirection and the movement of that work across users. That was an awesome idea to me. Hadn't really done it until I got a contract where they wanted a lot of it done. They had a lot of forms they wanted to build in PeopleSoft that they wanted to be workflow enabled. And going in Virtual Approver and trying to make that happen, especially trying to make it happen for a whole suite of forms, I quickly saw that it was going to be really troublesome, and there's going to be a lot of overhead, that basically the Virtual Approver didn't meet the real world need. So I built the first version of GTE Forms to add a layer on top of Virtual Approver. Eventually, as the years went by, Virtual Approver didn't get any better. We decided we really need for business analysts to be able to do something to set up their own workflow routing instead of relying on PeopleTools or application designer based objects like Virtual Approver did. So we created our own workflow engine that was functionally driven, and we used that for quite a few years until AWE came out. And as AWE stabilized and we saw this was a really powerful tool, we decided, okay, let's adopt it and then extend it to accomplish the real world things that we knew we needed to be able to do in addition to what delivered AWE could do.
That's really awesome. That's really cool. I like the history that you shared there too. You know, I have to admit, I didn't know that. That's pretty cool. So you were actually building AWE essentially before AWE existed. I mean, the idea.
Yeah.
You built an approval framework on top of PeopleTools. I love that. That's cool.
Yeah, for the same reasons that you mentioned that
Right.
The e-procurement team built AWE. It's because it makes more sense for the business analyst to actually be able to set up the workflow rules. And we wanted to enable that and get away from requiring a developer to actually build those Virtual Approver routings in App Designer before you could hook it into a workflow.
Right. That makes sense. So, Paul, I have some questions that my students ask regularly. And if you don't mind, I would like to ask you a couple of those questions.
Well, shoot.
Okay, great. So the first one is, it's that question that I mentioned earlier that students ask, what about that dynamic routing? And you heard what I said. I mean truly dynamic, so that it is reevaluated after every single step in the process.
Right. Yeah, so that's one of the things that we really needed to be able to do, because again, pretty much everything we do in our product is based on what we run into in highly complex real world case scenarios where we just say, oh yeah, we have to be able to do this. And so we enhance our product to be able to accomplish that. When we build our layer on top of AWE, getting around that static, or at least static, as you said, when the visualizer is initially set up at the first save point, we needed to get around that. And so we added a lot of layers of app package code on top of the delivered stuff to be able to do that. So for example, the 3-step routing process, person 1 starts the routing and it goes to the first approver. The first approver selects who the second approver should be off of a drop-down list, and then it routes to that person. That wouldn't work in delivered AWE.
Right.
Because that second step, user list, would have had to have been resolved when the initiator saved the component to begin with. With GTE Forms, we add a layer that goes through, recalculates the user lists at each save point to make sure that it's updated. So you could do that and say, yes, I'm going to take this field that was just updated by the first approver in order to determine who the second approver is.
Right. I love that. That makes sense. Exactly. That's exactly what I asked. And so that's one of the features that my customers ask about. I like what you said there too about these complex situations. Because what I find is, and people ask me about complex situations all the time, what I find is AWE is exceptional for these simple cases. And
Right.
yeah, exactly. And so what you're saying is, no, that's not how real life works. Real life isn't
Yeah.
that simple. I like that.
Yeah, exactly. You really, what we wanted to build when we designed GTE Forms, especially the most recent iteration, GTE Forms 3.0 and higher, was to have a smooth slide from simple to complex,
Mm,
where you do have simple requirements where AWE's configuration options suffice, but there's a big jump when you say, okay, well, I'm sorry, I can't determine who to route this form to just based on role membership.
right.
And so now I got to write people code to
Right.
figure out who to send it to. Or I need to send it to most of those people, but not some of them. That happens all the time. And then all of a sudden, oh, I can't use config anymore. I've got to go over and write people code. And what it comes down to in real life situations is if you're just using AWE, you almost always have to write code in order
Right.
to get down to the list that you're trying to get to.
Right.
And I can give you an example of how that looks in real life here. Of course, I just barely got kicked out of my session I was signed
No problem.
into.
No problem.
So let me just open that back up again here. And okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. So here in one of our form setup pages where we actually do the routing, we can use existing AWE routings, but we also include some delivered AWE routings that already have pre-built hooks that people code hooks that are actually in the routing that allow us to add another layer of config. So I can say, for example, here for approver one, I can come in and build use set-based logic to determine who I'm going to route to. So we have this concept of rosters with lots of different types of rosters that we can use to pull people in, to pull users in. And those include the members of roles. It includes the results of queries. Smart Source is our own construct that allows for people code and other data sources there, SQL objects, lots, or individual users, which probably usually isn't a good idea in a production setting. But so I can say, well, here let's route to the users in a particular role, like we'll grab all of the GTE Forms administrators, and then I can also say, well, but we also want to add another role. So let's say, for example, that I've defined some using existing people code. I've already determined some people that I want to include, like a certain group of notification recipients. Let's go ahead and just pick those, and then I want to say, oh, but I don't want it to route to the person who just worked on this form previously. So I'm going to subtract somebody from here. I'll come back into Smart Source and say, let's not include the last operator. And so now I'm going to go through the set logic, add together these groups, and then take out the last operator. I could also add a row that used the intersect to say, okay, they need to both be on this list and in this thing, so that I could use that for department security or to narrow down the list and say I only want to send it to the people who are in this department, in this role, and in this department. Lots of things that we can do to accomplish that. So again, it's still using AWE, but we've added this configuration-based layer to basically give the business analyst another layer of config before it gets to the point where you need someone to write some code.
Do you know how many dynamic role rules would go into accomplishing this same thing by creating a separate role that's the intersection or union
Yes.
of particular sets?
We do know that because we had to
Yes,
do it for so long. Uh,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly. And
yes.
plus, the dynamic role rules are stale, whereas this is
Mm-hmm.
evaluated immediately. Wow,
Yep, exactly.
this is cool. I
Exactly.
like it.
It's a lot of fun. We also have a layer on top of the criteria because really, when you think about it, for workflow, you need to answer really 4 questions. You've got who, when, how, and what. Who's supposed to get the routing? That's what we're adding config to with the rosters here. Then you have when it should route to them. That's the criteria. And that always almost ends up being people code based, just because usually the criteria for deciding whether or not to do a conditional step in the routing, it never ends up being something that you can. I'm sorry, that's pessimistic, but it seems like we always end up writing something in order to make that conditional routing. And then you have to decide who or how does the recipient access the workflow, and then what do they see when they access it. So this covers the who, visual if covers the what, and lets us go in and create a new logic part that says, okay, I'm going to look at various things, which could include fields on the form, can include all sorts of different things, and say, I'm going to route to this if this if this field equals this, or whatever. So, and I haven't actually added any fields to this form yet, so no form fields are listed, only these people code things. But I could still say, I only want to route here if the original EMPL ID is actually equal to or contains this value over here. And so I can easily create a logical statement, but I can make those complex logical statements that have any degree of complexity to add a conditional step to the routing, again, without having to go and write code.
Right. That's very cool. Thank you, Paul. I did have one
You
more
bet.
question for you, and that was on the HTML emails. You see, I mean, you know this already, and that is that AWE uses the old static text, well, sorry, static, that's the wrong term, text-based email templates. So AWE
Okay.
uses the virtual approver notification templates. And they're just plain old text, often with URLs embedded in them. And so customers
Mhm.
do ask, Jim, how do you create rich text emails for AWE? And you know my answer? My answer is you don't with delivered AWE. You
Right.
could, of course, modify AWE, but no, we don't advocate that. So we basically
Yeah.
just say, I'm sorry, that's not an option of AWE. So I'm curious, does GTE Forms offer a rich text solution?
You bet. And it's a great point. You said not with delivered AWE. Our approach, since we build custom PeopleSoft solutions, our first instinct, our first philosophy is if PeopleSoft provides the functionality, use it. If they don't provide the functionality, but it could be added on to what they already have, then extend it. If extending doesn't work, then replace it. So obviously with our AWE routing, we chose to extend AWE. For the notifications, there just wasn't enough there to work with, and so we replaced it. We build our own, and we can add notifications into our setup here in a number of different ways and control the recipients by the rosters and the visual ifs. and tie them into specific steps in the approval process. But one of the things with that email template setup, we did want to, again, real world required that we be able to send HTML-based emails. So we just built a template that would allow us to do that. One of the other limitations of the virtual approver notification framework is that you can't really put in any dynamic values. You don't have bind variables to where you can, without doing some customization, you can't really say, well, I want this name to be inserted into the email. So we did both here. We have an HTML-based flag, and this example I'm showing, I just grabbed an existing email HTML template and pasted it in here, and then added in some of my binds in order to produce an email that looks like this. So Jim, this has what you're looking for, a link that actually both works because it's an HTML link, but that also you can set some pretty print value for, so that some human readable text instead of just seeing a big HTTPS URL in there.
Right. Very good. Thanks for that, Paul. Thanks for sharing. Now, I have a bonus question for you.
Sure.
And that's around security because of phishing. What are you doing for notifications to help, or is that something that you guys have considered for notifications for phishing?
Yes, there are several things that you can do, and one of the more recent features that we came out with, you have one of the issues with phishing is you both have the problem of a hacker trying to produce links or produce emails that look like you, that look legitimate. But you also have the penetration issue of, well, I came across an old email for your corporation and it had a link into your PeopleSoft system. And so I followed that link, and then I just brute force attacked the password screen until I got in. You don't want that to happen. So we added this feature called Configure Tokens that allows us, if I can navigate and talk at the same time.
I can't either.
To add a token that can be sent out into the world in an email link. Like this one is intended to provide access to self-provision a parent to be able to see their students' information in the student system. One of the things that you need to do before you send out a link like that is make sure that it doesn't last forever, or else it ends up in an email archive that hackers get a hold of, and then they're trying to knock at the door and get in and self-provision for your system. So we have an expiration time on these tokens. So they only work, this one only works for 6 hours. So we send out an email, and we've associated a lot of information behind the scenes with that token. So once it goes out, we know what student it refers to, but we're not actually including that information in the link that's going out. That's all held back in the system, in the database. So all that we have to expose is a listener that actually that digests tokens and validates the token, and then the token listener knows if the token is expired, then no entry. If it's still valid, then it knows who it was sent to, and it knows who it's providing access to, and then they can actually even be daisy chained to provide longer term access. They also know where they're actually headed to eventually. They have a target destination. So you don't actually even have to expose the URL of your target destination in the email. You just send out this generic this generic email that points to your token listener, and it's just got this big long GUID attached to it that forms this token, and then the listener handles it from there, and the token knows how to route itself to your actual destination once the token's validated.
That's good. That's good. I like that. Hey, Paul, thanks for joining me. Thanks for sharing a little bit about the history, and definitely thanks for sharing about your product, the GTE Forms.
For those of you, the introduction. It's great to be here, Jim.
Great, thank you. Thanks. Those of you that are interested in learning more about GTE Forms and Gideon Taylor, we'll be sure to include a link to their website within our show description. And if you'd like to know more about our training material, training opportunities, please be sure to check out our website. And if you enjoyed this video and want to learn more, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And we look forward to seeing you in the next video.